Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. I am very excited to be discussing the 7 sermons to the dead. Today, we are going to cover Sermo 1, but we are going to start with an overview. So I'm going to ask Muriel. Muriel has done Meetup on Fairy Tale with us. She's been a Jungian trained in Zurich. And so first question, what do you think of 7 Sermons to the Dead, and where does it fit in the work of Carl Jung?
Okay, that's a pretty broad question, so it gives me an opportunity to go exactly where I want. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of a story, in that when somebody comes into analysis with me, and I've been an analyst for over 20 years, that one of the first questions, or an early question that I ask them is, what was your entry into Jung? How did you discover him? More often than not, it's memories, dreams, and reflections, kind of read in their youth, and then came, touched it again in some college work, and then kind of came back to it. But for me, I don't ask anything of my people that I won't also ask of me. My entry into Jung was Answer to Job. And what I loved about Answer to Job, so that was pretty much my first introduction to him, that I think I got Jung unplugged, meaning that he was no longer trying to prove anything to anybody. He was simply wading into his theory and answering it. And so that was the Jung that I first encountered. And then when I went into the collected works, boom, it was like I hit a wall, because it was so dense and it was so, scientific, and it was proving his theory. And I'm not a mystic, I'm a scientist. I'm a scientist. I am a scientist. I'm not an artist, I am a scientist. And so I got frustrated. And then I re-entered Jung with 7 Sermons to the Dead. And I thought, there you are. In my estimation, Jung's 7 Sermons to the Dead are his opus. And I remember teaching at the Jung Institute in Zurich, and this was shortly after the Red Book had been published. And so we were gathered to speak of Jung after the Red Book. This wasn't when Sonia Shamsadani was introducing it. This was a group of analysts, and we were presenting to students and trying to really make some sense of how we had to refigure Jung in light of the Red Book. And I had, because I traveled from Canada to Zurich, there was no way I was putting in my carry-on luggage the Red Book, because it was so heavy and it was so thick. But I was able to bring the reader's version of Jung. And so here I am speaking, and that was my part, to speak to why I thought the 7 Sermons to the Dead was such an important milestone in Jung's work. And so I had this, I'm at the podium and I have this in my hand, and it's like I was caught up in this energy. And if you've got one of these, it feels very much, dare I say it, like a Bible, it's leather covered, it's got the ribbons. And I found myself kind of almost pounding the pulpit saying, this is Jung's opus. This is what his work is all about. This is the condensation. So I'm rather passionate about the 7 Sermons to the Dead, because I think what Jung does in that is he gives us his encounter with the archetype. He gives us the encounter with that which is transgenerational, transhuman, therefore archetypal. And the language is very difficult, because you could almost say he is caught in an archetypal possession. And in many respects, that's what Jung's work was. And then, unlike the psychotic, what Jung did is he processed and processed and processed. So as we know now, that the encounters that gave birth to the Red Book and the 7 Sermons then was processed and delivered to us in the collected works. So if you want to understand his process, you read the Red Book. If you want to understand the archetypal underpinnings of his genius, then you read the Seven Sermons to the Dead. Because I think what he's working out there is what was unfinished by the Christian story, and then what was in fact got distracted there by something. Okay, what was unfinished in okay, let me get my thought again. What was unfinished in the Christian myth, in the Christian story, that then he was bringing forward. He was bringing forward, Endinger would say, a new revelation. I don't go that far, but I do believe what Jung does is he says, the dead are with us. The dead are amongst us. The dead need to be answered. What was not answered in their life, we must pick up the task. And I think that's what he does in the Seven Sermons to the Dead. It's dense, it's difficult. I don't understand it completely, but I think it's certainly worthy of exploration. And so when Shurkant told me he was going to do this and would I like to participate, I thought, okay, well, I don't have the bandwidth to go into a deep exploration, but I can give you my general impression. And my general impression is just that I believe that this is Jung's opus. And I don't know that you can totally understand Jung without at least wading into the Seven Sermons. One other story. I had an opportunity at the 50th anniversary of Jung's death, the memorial. I was invited by Jung's grandson with a number of other analysts to Bollingen. And it was wonderful. They picked us up with a ferry at the dock, and we went to where the stones were mined. And the captain of the ship was the grandson of the man who used to deliver the stones to Bollingen. So it was like, oh, this is just so cool. And then we went back for a little kind of wine and cheese at Bollingen. And then into the night, a few of us were invited to stay back while most of the folks carried on. And we had a chance to go in, and Daniel Bauman took us into the various rooms. And I can tell you that when I saw Philemon on the wall and the care and the attention that Jung gave to that teacher, to that guide, told me that he definitely had the capacity to move between two worlds. And I think that's what the Seven Sermons gives us. So I'm going to try not to pound the pulpit tonight, but I will say I believe passionately that this is a work worth delving into.
Yeah, right. I mean, first time I looked at it, I was completely blown away because, an artistic creation can do a lot more than a thick academic volume. What I found is that I could hang everything that Jung is saying on this. So this is like the core of his metaphysics, his core ideas about human beings, all of them presented to you right there. And for me, I'm very comfortable with the language of it, because it is in the kind of the old, old religious tradition, and I'm comfortable with that. And the interesting thing is that we are now studying Bhagavad-Gita, and I see the echoes of that in this. So it is just incredible. So I think if I wanted to start with Jung and get a picture to kind of orient myself, I think this is I don't see anything better. I have not seen anything better. So wonderful. So now let's look at the Sermo 1. It has two concepts, the Pluroma and Creatura. Now, do you want to talk about the Sermo 1 before we go to other people?
No, let's go to other people so we get that foundation first. And then...
Sounds good. All right, folks, now I'm going to call on people who are very familiar with Jung. Even if you're not familiar with this work, for people who have read Jung, and I want to invite you to talk about your impressions of this work as a whole. Let's see. Victor, would you like to share?
Thanks, Shrikant. I'm pretty sure I'm grossly underqualified to make any statements, but the only thing that I can add is over the last few months, I am reading Jung, and my introduction to Jung was from Jordan Peterson, and his work gave me a gateway to get into Jung, and essentially understanding the two worlds, the intangible world and the tangible world, and also the collective unconscious and the projections. So these are the things that Jordan Peterson has introduced, and now that I'm going through his works, it is giving me a good foundation. So that these sermons, I only came to know about these sermons from you and from the meetup, and I went through a couple of videos, and there are some explanations about these sermons on YouTube, and I went through a few of them, learning a lot. So that's the only thing that I can add. But it's amazing. Yeah.
Thank you, Victor. Victor did a series of meetups on the psychological meaning of Bible, and the meetups on Jordan Peterson's maps of meaning with us. All right, now I'm going to open it up for anybody to talk about what was your reaction when you read this work. Any thoughts? Let's see here. I'll go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you'd like to share. We're going to start with Rupali, followed by Joe. Rupali.
Thank you, Shrikant. My introduction to Jung's work was again through this meetup when you mentioned it in a few meetups ago. Mm-hmm. And when I first listened to the 7 sermons, I was just blown away because the parallels between the Bhagavad-Gita and this were a lot. And if I had not kind of participated in the Bhagavad-Gita meetups, I think this would have been very difficult for me to understand. And so Bhagavad-Gita kind of made it Bhagavad-Gita was a stepping stone to be able to get this is my first reading of the sermon, so it's just at the basic superfluous level, but I enjoyed it. I really like the part where the Pluroma and the Creatura. I think it also is similar to the manifest and the manifest in the Gita. So I'm looking forward to the series. Thank you for coordinating.
Thank you, Rupali. Next up is Joe. Folks, go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to share your impressions about the 7 sermons to the dead as a whole. Joe, go ahead.
Yes, I too am, grossly unqualified to make an assessment on this, but I did listen to it and read it. I do see some clear parallels, as everyone has said, with the Bhagavad-Gita as well. I also kind of, as I started to dig into it a little bit, you start to see the core of Jung's ideas, of where he gets the ideas of the archetypes and the individuation process, that you start to really be able to unpack it. And it seems like it's a mystical aspect of this that he's really kind of capturing. It is a very difficult read, but I really started to see clearly how the external world, impacts your being, and then how that individuation process comes to fruition, especially about when I was reading even about Pluroma, how it's used in the Christian context. It was interesting to hear Muriel mentioned how that it kind of finishes what the Christian what the Christianity has kind of left behind, and the Creatura, that aspect of it as well, is that how you distinguish yourself from the world. I found that to be, so you start to see this, and I also see kind of some of the things that we talked about in Gita as far as the center and the periphery, and how we manage ourselves in order to go inside, in order to manage ourselves out to the world. So those are just some thoughts that I had, initially, but again, I'm learning with everyone else.
Thank you, Joe. Next up is Zach. Zach, go ahead.
Yeah. So what Muriel said about the unfinished aspects of Christianity was true, and I think the first sermon, like, he starts talking about the Pluroma, and then he says, well, you can't really talk about it. And so that is where East meets West, in the sense of you have the Taoist idea of, the Tao that can be spoken is not the real Tao. But you have Christianity, whose entire existence is based on, in the beginning was the Word. So you have the Gospel of John against Lao Tzu, the Taoist idea of you can't talk about this. This isn't something you can really talk about. And so but I think there still needs to be words. You still have to say something. And so I think, like, that's what the sermon is. That's the road of what it's wrestling with, because the words really do have their limitations. And if you don't acknowledge what Lao Tzu is saying, then you're failing to appreciate just how much reality is not included in the words whenever words are actually used. But Christianity leans so heavily on scripture that it can hardly function without words. So if you're gonna have East meet West, you're gonna need to address this issue somehow. So I feel like that's kind of what Sermon 1 is doing.
Great point, Zach. Thank you. So I think the issue of, I really like the way in which it begins, that the city of Alexandria, where the East meets West. In a very deep way, Jung has done that. Jung has brought in the Eastern way of thinking into psychology, the Western psychology. Second, the ideas, many people noticed many of the folks here who have been studying Bhagavad-Gita notice the similarities. It is Brahma, which is everything, and Prakriti, which is the manifested. And the way in which he's talking about it, it is that concept. It is the Tao and the 10,000 things. So it is definitely, these ideas from the East that is being talked about. And it is very hard to talk about them, but you have to talk about them. Because what they do is that you will not be able to grasp it, but you'll be able to point in a general direction. Say they are somewhere, and you keep triangulating to move closer to it. Thank you. Next up is going to be John, Madeline, and Arthur. John.
So I'm just trying to get an understanding of where Jung is coming from with these kind of theories. Like, is he like in some kind of like trance state, I don't know, like drug induced or something like that? Or is this, just like his theories about things in general?
Sure, we'll deal with that. Thank you. Next up is Madeline, followed by Arthur. Madeline.
Okay, thanks, Shrikant. Thanks, Muriel. I appreciated what Zach said about words. I just listened to this evening in preparation for this. I haven't sat down and read it, but I did have the impression that it's a sort of intensely personal vision that's very difficult to convey in writing. The overall, it struck me almost as a tour from the most basic to the most complex in terms of thinking and imagery. And also kind of a tour of the world's religions, starting with Taoism, brief detour into Christianity or Zoroastrianism with God and the devil, then the multiple gods of Hinduism and Buddhism. And then at the end, it did seem to be a lot of personal symbolic imagery. As I don't know, if it were a system of spirituality, it would seem needlessly complicated. But since it's Jung, I'm much more open-minded because I love some of his other works that I've read, Answer to Job and Synchronicity. And I also had the impression at the end, I just was wondering how much of that was his original visions, and did he go back in and kind of tidy things up and make them a bit symmetrical? Because he did like symmetry. So some of it may have seemed a little bit excessive to me because of that.
Fantastic points, Marilyn. It's always been very stunning to me, just this entire phenomena of the Red Book, that he comes up with these intuitions, these visions. And in some ways, I see Seven Sermons to the Dead is the word version, of the Red Book. The same thing that he's trying to do with the Red Book of capturing all these relations. He's doing that in words here. And as he has said, that he worked these things out, vision form and rest of it. I really like the point that Muriel meant, that then rest of his life he was processing, clarifying, expanding, just all kinds of things. So just thank you. Next up is going to be Arthur, followed by Brian. Arthur.
Yeah, I would concur with what John McCarthy said, I think, about I didn't get it. This is my first exposure to Jung, really. I mean, I have a vague notion of his archetypes, the idea of archetypes, but have never read anything by him. And reading this, I thought, I don't get it. It's not phrased as a thou shalt anything. It's not about what one should do. It is not giving guidance. It is attempting to explain the state of the world, right? Or to say, this is the way the world is, period. But not by generalizations. It's not like Aristotle or anything where it's saying, like, here's some examples of how the world is. This is just completely first principles. Here's a term you've never heard of, the Pluroma or whatever, right? And I'm going to define it this way, and Abraxas is defined this way. And I'm gonna stop saying God and start saying Helios, and then later I'm going to say God anyway. It's a lot of definitions, and as a first-time reader, I'm thinking, okay, when are we going to do something with these definitions? And it never comes. And most of these words were new to me. But doing a bit of Wikipediaing afterwards, I found that the sort of prophet or Gnostic visionary to whom he attributes this, Basilides, was a real person.
Wonderful. Let me, Arthur, let me go ahead and respond to both you and John. I think this is very interesting because it's certainly, this writing is not a modern writing. This is not what you would find in university textbooks. You would not find, this is actually in the tradition of the wisdom literature. Whether it is Bible, if you read Bible, if you read Tao Te Ching, if you read Bhagavad-Gita, this is the kind of writing it is. The topic is metaphysical, as you were rightly pointing out. It is metaphysical. What is the nature of reality? And that's what you're trying to grapple with. And it is done in intensely artistic way. This is an artistic way of capturing the world. And this tradition of writing is not the modern tradition. It is, but it is very much like the tradition in the axial age. If you read, some of the works from the axial age are like this. Just like that, when you read Tao Te Ching, it will say things, Dao Ke Dao, Fei Chang Dao. So it will say Dao that can be spoken of is not the real Dao. Just like that. So it is in that tradition. Next up, and I can fully understand that somebody used to the modern writing, they will say, what is this? But in some ways, this is like the Red Book. I want to give the analogy of the Red Book. It is trying to capture some deep relationships about what the world is, who we are, in a shot. That's what they are trying to do. Next up is Brian.
This is pretty different from my
Yes.
impression of the Bhagavad-Gita, that there was a lot of thou shalt in the Bhagavad-Gita, right? I mean, it says
No. Thou shalt is a separate question. The thing is, I think this particular one does not go to the thou shalt in a detail. But even for Bhagavad-Gita, if you read, what I would do is that if you take the sermon 1, I would recommend that you read chapter 15 of Bhagavad-Gita. It is exactly dealing with the same thing. Chapter 15 of Bhagavad-Gita is talking about exactly the same thing as the sermon 1. Here he's calling Pluroma and Creatura. There they are calling Brahma and Prakriti. And that, there is a difference in expression style, but it is about the same thing. So that's where I would start off, if that helps. Next up is going to be Brian.
Okay. This is the first thing that I have read from Jung, and I think, as many people have said, I think I would have thought it was total nonsense, except since I've been studying like the Tao and the Gita and things like that. I was like, I put, oh, Brahman, Prakriti, I think this is non-attachment here. And then I even put, this sounds kind of like drift with the devil, you know what I mean? And then I thought that the first chapter ended up, though, with the new spirituality of Yasuhiko, when he was talking about that really what man needs to strive for is your own being. And that's kind of what I had gleaned from Yasuhiko's series that we've had so far, that is a higher level, but that's what, what man could be.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Penny. Muriel, would you like to comment on any of the things people said?
Sure. First off, I'm impressed with the level of study, obviously, this group has grown together with, and the fact that you can make those parallels is just so lovely, because I think that's the way we come to a deeper understanding. In terms of the style of writing of the 7 sermons, I mean, it is elevated language. It's like, it's like what Shakespeare is to English, that Elizabethan language is a kind of elevated way that's poetry and prose and dialogue. Well, I think in some respects that this style of writing is to show here is a creature grappling with something that is beyond the creature. And so that whole idea that his, like as Zach said, his fidelity to wrestling with words to try to convey something that is so much bigger than that is really what we are asked to do. I mean, as our individuation, our finding our own soul or destiny is our ability to grapple with what comes at us, both from within and from without. And it is in the struggle that the understanding is made. the way I like to look at these concepts, I don't have that religious sensibility so much as I have the psychological sensibility. But it's like what Irving Laszlo said, field precedes form. So there is this field, which is the archetypal field, which is the universal energies, and the way that those universal energies coalesce universally across cultures, across time. And because field precedes form, that's what gives form to the archetypal. The difference between the archetype and the archetypal form, because the archetype is the field. We're never going to know the archetype. We're going to know the form as in
Just a second.
the mother. I'm sorry?
Hold on. Sorry, there was a problem. Give me just a second.
Okay.
Hold on.
I got him, Shrikant.
Okay, thanks. Sorry
Okay,
about
so the field precedes form. So when that energy coalesces, because the attention that we pay to it, our willingness to grapple with the concepts and say, can I explain it this way? Can I explain it that way? Is it meant to be explained in word? Is it meant to be explained in image? And that constant back and forth is what Jung is showing us in the 7 sermons, because in fact, that's what he's doing. So it's not a formula, it's not a recipe, it's not a thou shalt. It's like, see, this is what I did. And then he continues to do that as he develops his psychological theories and his collected works. But I think if we can understand it psychologically as field and form, then we understand how his psychology takes the Christian story, founded, well, not even just the Christian story, but the Judeo-Christian vision, and extends it into secular or contemporary modernity. And so field and form is the same idea. So I guess that's what I would
Let me
add.
ask a follow-up question. In what sense is he extending the Christian story? Can you talk a little bit about the extension?
The dead came back from Jerusalem because they found not what they were seeking, meaning that they had unanswered questions, and that those questions had to be answered as they have to be answered every generation. And that's why we have this incredible archive of the world religions, because we keep trying to answer the questions that are unanswerable. And so, if you know anything about Jung's life, I mean, he was raised by a mother who was probably a medium and a mystic, and he was raised by a father who was a disenfranchised Christian pastor. So clearly he's got the tension between those two things. And then he's trying to find his own way. He's trying to find, so what does that all mean, with not necessarily rejecting and saying, I founded a new religion, but in modern parlance, in the language of the time, how can I explain these mysteries? And I think that's what he's doing.
Sure. Last question. Many people also noticed it, and I also noticed it in a big way. This idea of Pluroma and Creatura just dovetails the idea of the Brahma and Prakriti. So can you talk a little bit about the influence of Indian thought on Jung?
Well, I'm not an expert by any means in terms of that strand of Jung's thinking, but certainly he was on fire with alchemy until he found the secret of the golden flower. And then the idea that he had that Eastern understanding, which he thought reinforced many of the things that he had discovered. He was also cautious that we don't take the the ideas of the East and try to transplant them to the West. He said we do damage to both. And if you read some of his writings on yoga, it's like, really? Because with the Alan Watts who have brought those ideas to the mainstream, you read that and you're thinking, did he really think that doing positions of yoga would actually cause a Western mind to blow up? Well, I'm paraphrasing, but he was very cautious because I think he had deep respect. He had deep respect for the field out of which the form of a world religion came. And you can't just then take the fruit of that and apply it to a different context. And so he was very clear about that. So I do believe he said when East meets West, there has to be a margin. There has to be a fringe, that you cannot just, the divine marriage or the divine conjunctio is the goal, but it's holding the tension between the two. And I think that's what he's doing in this.
Wonderful. Thank you. Folks, now let's move on to Sermon 1 itself and what you got from it. There are these two big concepts of Pluroma and Creatura. So any thoughts? If you want to put your thoughts down, you're welcome to do that. You can type exclamation mark. If you have any questions, you can do that. We'll collect all the questions and then we'll deal with all of them together. So go ahead and type an exclamation mark to discuss the Sermon 1 itself. So far, we've been looking at this work as a whole and its place in Jung's work. Now we'll be going to Sermon 1. What do you guys think? Any impressions, any thoughts, any questions? Go ahead and type an exclamation mark. We'll start with Zach. Oh, just a second. Let me go ahead and unmute. Go ahead.
I already gave my first thoughts about it, like with the Tao and not being able to talk about the thing, but still needing to talk about it. But my next thought is about Creatura, which is this fact that people talk about the oneness, the mystical oneness, but I see this all the time is that they lose track of the necessity of living creatures to be distinct, in the sense that life can't live without asserting itself. So any creature in which like life is going to occur, even if distinction is an illusion, they have to maintain that illusion. They have to live that illusion. Even if it's not real, they have to live that illusion. And I feel like that is a critical issue that today you can't find anybody who understands that, I will say. Like, they don't understand that life, in order to live, has to assert itself. And everybody just assumes, oh, we'll just all get along, it'll all be one big happy family. And we can just totally ignore the necessity of individual creatures and groups to assert themselves. But I feel like that's what Creatura is underneath it all. I feel like that's what it's really about, is that if you can't live without distinguishing yourself, without conceiving of yourself as different from everything else.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you, Zach. Great observations. I really like the formulation that Jung has here. And folks, go ahead and type exclamation mark to share. What he's saying is that Creatura has a nature. As creatures, we have a nature, and our ultimate meaning for us, or ultimate goal for us, is to be that, is striving to be who you are. That is a very deep idea of Jung that expresses itself everywhere. The individuation of saying, you are who you are, and you have a distinct nature. You are a distinctive creature. You are distinguished from other things. You are who you are. Understand the nature and act from it. Thank you. Next up is going to be Maritza.
From this first ceremony, what I got out of it that I thought was fascinating was similar to what you just pointed out for us, the reminder of, striving not after like a difference, but to strive for our own being. I really was fascinated by how he says that, you know, the moment we are striving for the good or the beautiful, that we're forgetting our own nature. I think this is a lovely way of showing us what he meant in some of his other works, or maybe his other works are almost more technical manner of saying the same thing. I almost found this section, that just the piece on that, like the striving destroys the original nature, and the original nature is the distinctiveness, which is what you were aiming for anyway. I find that an easier thing to understand than some of the other concepts he has proposed for us regarding the self, the ego, but it's the same thing. I don't know if that's clear. Like, I can tell that it's the same concept and it's the same author providing the concept, but in this way, it's like coming at it without the technicalities, is what I'm seeing here. Like, it's kind of like if I needed to study science and somebody gave me a work of art instead to kind of trick my brain into getting it.
Yeah, no, this is actually a very deep point. And that's exactly why I love this work, the 7 Sermons to the Dead, this much. Because what it does is that it just simply directly goes to the heart of the issue, and just shows you this is the heart of the issue. It's not trying to argue. It is not trying to distinguish itself from all the other theories, and you could think about it this way. It just goes, this is an artistic expression capturing the meaning, the deepest meaning of the core concepts. And that's why it has this enormous power. So you can actually get the core concepts here far more easily. Thank you, Marisa. Great points. Next up is Joe.
Can I just interject here for a second? Like, I love that. I love what you just said there, because this is why I think it's his opus, because I think what he does here, he shows us the heart of the matter. He says it's like these are the building blocks, and everything else is just another way to elucidate what it's almost, and I correct myself, it's not what he believes, just like his concept of God. When asked, do you believe in God? He said, I don't need to believe, I know. And that's what this seems to be. I know we have a nature, and I know it's our life's task to live out of that and express it as fully as we can. Yet if we strive to do that, we divorce ourselves from it. So I think you understand it very well. I think that's very well articulated.
Wonderful. Thank you, Muriel. Feel free to just jump in anytime you want. Next up is Joe.
I mean, I'm not going to, perhaps provide anything earth-shattering here, but it's the ability kind of to separate yourself from your environment. Is the Creatura is what my main takeaway from this particular, this I started to actually understand the Pluroma a bit. There were some questions that I have when it says, that you must not forget that the Pluroma hath no qualities. And that part is a little bit confusing to me, because we create it through our own personal thinking. I was wondering if somebody maybe could expand on that. But for me, it was more or less just understanding the unconscious. And this is where you kind of see other parts of Jung's work. And that's the Pluroma, where you start to see our unconscious, psychological state that essentially is formed by our environment. And so, and then how do we break away from that? And what is the process for that? And again, that comes back to this whole idea of the individuation process, which is pretty clear in this first chapter for me. But I have a lot of questions from it, more than anything else. I have a lot more questions than I do any kind of I had the basic takeaways. So yeah,
Okay,
I'll leave it there.
Yeah, Joe, what we'll do is that we will do the whole questions. Let's let everybody go, and then I'll call on you again for questions. Just go ahead and organize all your questions, and we will take all of them. Next up is Victor.
All right, Shrikant, I also have a question regarding Pluroma and we being a subset of Pluroma, and the fundamental question that we run into. So as you were saying, so we are doing questions later, right?
You can go ahead and ask the question now. Go ahead.
Gotcha. So my question is, the way he puts the idea of Pluroma is, it is everything. It is everything and it is nothing. And we are a figment in that Pluroma. And we, although we are a figment or a very tiny subset of Pluroma, we still have the Pluroma in ourselves, which means we are a little bit of everything. And on top of it, since we are not everything, and we are a tiny bit of that everything, our human nature is to be distinct. And our nature is to be something unique. And while he presents this idea, he also says that a human trying to be distinct, while we are trying to be distinct, we also have the other nature that is indistinctiveness. And I kind of got the information, but I couldn't glue it properly. So if there is anyone who can understand it.
Oh, I can try. Okay. And I can try, because I think it's also picking up on what Joseph said, that we know that in science, the observer can affect the observed. So we're dealing with that ability to hold the potential, yet recognize what is manifesting. And what is manifesting is going to affect our understanding of, call it potential. So Jung said that, like the self, which is that ultimate archetype of wholeness that contains everything, he said the self is the center and the circumference of the personality. Well, how do you get that? Like, how is it the circumference and the center? But I think that is an explanation of how we are part of the Pluroma, and we are also distinct from it, because what part of that are we called to manifest? And what we do or fail to do is going to affect the whole. And so that's why he said that the work of individuation was the only work, because to go out and try to affect change is going to be removed from your nature, removed from the part that you are meant to manifest. So the idea of we are part of that, yet we are the creature who must manifest, incarnate, do our work, because the extent to which we understand the whole is going to be how clear our vision is. And so our vision will become clear if we look into that center, which is also the circumference. So it feels like a little like a riddle, but I think that's the point, is because it's describing something that's ineffable. But this is the best that we can do, as all the other great religions have done. And again, I'm not saying this is a religion, but I'm saying this is a way that modern man can grapple with how do we use our individual carnation to affect creation, to affect the cosmos. And that's what he's grappling with here.
Wow. Thank you, Muriel. Next up is going to be Victor. Philip, Phil, Maritza, and then Joe. Phil.
Hey, everybody. Good to be here. I just wanted to share some of the parallels that came to mind to me as I was reading this. Didn't have a lot of time to peruse it, but as I was reading, several things came to mind, and I thought maybe they might be helpful or interesting parallels. So one of them is Hegel and this idea of unity of nothing, being and non-being, right? That's, if you've ever read Science of Logic, that's how he starts out, this unity of being. And when I was reading the sermon number 1, I mean, that just struck me because that is exactly how he opens up. So I'm curious if perhaps Jung had some Hegelian roots there. The other one was the Hermetic tradition and Gnosticism in general, this idea of the conflict of the soul versus the world, the created, the creature, and this sort of journey of the soul. And it seems to me, I haven't read far enough, but it seems to me that there's some echoes of this tension and of this desire to come back to something that we've lost, or to reunite with something that we've lost. So this idea of consciousness versus the world type of conflict or tension. Another one is Plato's Timaeus and this idea of infinity and time. Again, just struck me, this idea of creature versus Creatura versus Pluroma. Pluroma strikes me as this sort of idealized, ideal, absolute, eternal, immovable, Platonic form, versus the creature as this sort of expression, but that is bound up with all these imperfections. But at the same time, as was mentioned earlier, it has parts of that pleroma in it. And time, as we know, has elements of not infinity, I should say, eternity in it, because the present is a picture of eternity, right? The now that we have, that's the eternal moment that sort of God gave us as a reminder of eternity as a thing. And this, so some of these traditions, I'm just curious if, I know Jung was an amazingly erudite person, and I'm curious if maybe Muriel can comment on if she is aware of any explicit mentions of these traditions in his writing, or if he sort of anyway, if they were used in his thinking somehow.
Muriel, go ahead.
I said, what didn't he mention? I mean, that's the point. I mean, I think that Jung was so incredibly well read, and both his research and the research that both Marie-Louise von Franz and Emma Jung did for him and brought him these texts, and he would pore over them and read them, and they inevitably found their way into his work. I think that's, so if you think of the Black books as being his raw exploration, and then the Red book is a refining of the Black books, and then the 7 Sermons to the Dead is the distillation of that, and then the collected works is his attempts to bring that out to the world. I think it's important to note that of the tome that became the Red book, that the 7 Sermons was the only one that was published and given while he was still, able to either defend it or run from it. And so I think that it's important to, I think that that's an important piece, because when he is distilling what he experienced in those early raw visions, he is going to be influenced by everything that he reads. What is that, cryptomnesis or something? I can't remember what the word is, or I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but that whole idea that, Philip, the connections that you made, I would bet you could find if you did an index search of the collected works, you would probably find the references, at least you'd find the footnotes.
Wonderful, thank you. I just wanted to address something that Victor said. Victor, this play between Pluroma and Creatura, I would recommend reading the 15th chapter of Bhagavad-Gita. It describes this, the whole, the center and the periphery as a whole, and then a particular thing within it, and the play between that. I think Bhagavad-Gita does a fantastic job of describing it. So just that concept, I think I would recommend the 15th chapter for that. Next up is Maritza, followed by Rupali. Maritza.
I just wanted to make one more quick comment. The question of the Pluroma, I did not catch, or I didn't find that anywhere it was telling us that this was thinking. In fact, I thought it was saying that it was not thinking. What came to mind when reading about the description of the Pluroma in this Sermo 1 was the concept of the action and not action that we studied in the Tao Te Ching, because I really like also the way Muriel said it of when we observe something, the act of observing affects the observation. I think, and that's as I understand that we're being shown for the Pleroma. And I also wanted to mention, maybe for folks who are struggling a little bit with the concept, to consider it as consciousness. And it's one of those things that as we improve, when we are in a perfect spot where improvement is happening, we are unaware of consciousness, of ourselves, as it were. And in that unawareness is where the growth happens, because when you come back to, and you're now again aware of yourself is a newer, improved version. I hear in this passage that Jung is inviting us to imagine that the Pleroma is that thing happening, the unawareness, or it's a matter of, like, I like what you said, the center to periphery. It's that switch in focus is what I'm hearing that he's describing here.
Thank you, Maritza. I see Pluroma as just the Tao, or the Brahma, which is just reality, what is the core of it, the universal principle of it in all its manifestation included. So it's just everything. That's what I understand by Pluroma. Next up is going to be Rupali, followed by Joe. Rupali.
So I want to talk about the qualities of Pluroma. And I thought, the pairs of opposites really struck out to me, because whether it's in Christianity or Bhagavad-Gita or in Taoism, these pairs are there, like whether it's the feminine and the masculine, the dark and the light, the creation versus destruction. And what Jung says in this chapter is that these distinctions that we make are in our thinking. And so to be able to, to really strive for our own being, then we need to be able to think clearly and hold the thought in leash. And I thought, okay, so that brings us back to Louis Sullivan, or to Bhagavad-Gita, or to the drifting in Napoleon Hill's book, that, holding your thought in leash is such a big part of every philosophy. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rupali. Great observations. Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by John. Joe.
So I have a quick question, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So there's something that that was said about the idea of the potential and the manifestation itself. And I'm wondering, how does the potential relate to our shadow, and the manifestation relate to our persona? And that we were talking about the self being in the middle of this, and it relates to other concepts of Jung. Or am I thinking too far ahead here?
Go ahead, Muriel. Would you like?
Yeah, it's a big question. Let's see if I understand it. That Okay, ask it again because I lost it.
So basically, you were talking about how the self is seen in the center.
Yeah.
And how there's this potential, and then there's the manifestation of the potential itself,
Right.
and how the self is in the center. And I'm thinking about this in terms of how that relates to persona and our shadow, as well as like if there's a relationship between the potential, which is I would think is our shadow. And then I was thinking about the manifestation of it being our persona and the self being in the middle if I were drawing a diagram.
Yeah, okay. In Jung's map of the soul, the persona is that encounter with the collective, right? The way the costume that we put on, the role that we play. And so that's the furthest from the actual core of the individual. So the persona, it's usually a defeat of the persona that brings somebody into analysis. Like I got sick, I lost my job, I lost my partner, whatever. And then the ego is the one that is going to be the vehicle that carries this journey. Right? Unlike the Eastern philosophy, which is to transcend the ego. In the Western, certainly in the Jungian parlance, the ego is essential because it's the vehicle that will move between. And then the shadow is all the things that, there's almost like the polarities that have already been mentioned, the tension of the opposites between the persona and the shadow. And then you come into that deeper level. So when you're doing the work, it's, there's been a blow to the persona. Do you have a strong enough ego to take the deep journey? The first encounter has to be everything that has been denied or projected. And then you encounter the organ of perception, which is the anima or the animus. That becomes that which then gives you access to the unconscious. Now, if that organ of perception is contaminated with the constraints of the ego or the denial of the shadow or the investment in the persona, then that observer is not going to see the collective unconscious. It's not going to see all the possibilities because it's going to be so narrow. So if you talk about it in terms of what this sermon gives us, it gives us that positioning that says, can I observe, and how pure is the observer to that which I am observing? Okay, and obviously complexes and shadow and misunderstandings will eclipse that, but it is the willingness to like as Martitza said, I think, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing your name right, that you go into that and then you come out again and you're looking at the world new again. So it's like you have a deeper understanding of that which you don't understand. And so you're always getting closer and closer, or more layered and more layered to your understanding, which is your individuation.
Wow. Thank you, Muriel. See, I think this is the power of this work, that it just focuses on the self. Like if you get self right and all the movements right, then everything else is detailed. So it's just beautiful. Thank you. Next up is going to be John. John, go ahead.
Can you talk more about that, what you just talked about, how close is the observer to what they are observing? Because I think that could be an interesting concept. Like, sometimes I wonder how accurate is what I'm perceiving in my own mind. Like how close to reality are my own thoughts, as to what maybe other people think or what the right way to think is.
Yeah. Well, I would challenge the right way to think, maybe what is the true way to think in terms of your truth in the larger truth, or your individuation in the larger story. But I think we have to be aware that the complexes are it's like this energy that will eclipse and cloud our ability to see. And we can rarely like one of my supervisors used to say, Muriel, if it's shadow, you can't see it. Everyone around you can, but you can't, because the shadow will manifest itself in projection or in these missteps. So that the whole idea of individuation is that our organ of perception becomes pure water as opposed to muddy water, or as opposed to contaminated water. Because if we can open up that path, then the ego has access to the self. The ego self-access, there's nothing in the way of it. And so that's the goal. It's for the creature to know creation and know that there's actually an interplay between the two. I don't know if that answers your question, John, but certainly we have to ask, is what I'm seeing and what I know accurate? And so hence the dreams. The dreams will say, from the point of view of the self, the point of view of the soul, it's as if you were in a boat that was in a storm. You're not in a boat in a storm, but it's like the dream is trying to correct your vision back to its source, back to the right relationship.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Let's see. The next, I don't know, Yogeshwar, I wanted to ask you one thing. Would you be able to give a short summary of chapter 15? If you can't do it, that's fine. Give me.
Yeah, it's fine. I can do
Okay.
it.
Okay. So, folks, what I want to do is I want to now place the. I want you to hear now the Gita version of this idea of Pluroma and Creatura. Its version. Okay. Maybe it is different. Maybe it is the same. Okay. But I want to understand it in its own terms first. So you have it as a reference. Okay. Many of you are participating in the Gita meetup, so you're familiar with this, but many of you are not. So Yogeshwar is going to give a short summary of chapter 15. And if you find it interesting, I encourage you to go ahead and read it yourself. Go ahead, Yogeshwar.
So I'm just going to summarize it in a lump sum. So from the start, it's talking about what the ultimate is, and then how it relates to what we are seeing in our manifest world. Everything comes from the ultimate. There's nothing that doesn't originate from the ultimate. And the peripheral, let's say, which is the manifest, and the center, which is the ultimate. So all the peripheral, there can't be any point which is at the peripheral that doesn't join onto the center. That's why in verse 6, it's written that everything is part of me. Yeah, Mamaivansho Jiva Loke. Everything which you are seeing in this world is part of me. There's nothing that is void of me. In a way, where Krishna is talking about this, from where he's talking about this is from the standpoint that if you look from the point of the center, everything is part of the center, even the peripheral. And then at the end of the chapter, Krishna is talking about these two distinct things, that there is the manifest, which is the peripheral, there is the unmanifest, which is the center. And then there is also that which is beyond the manifest and the unmanifest. Krishna is also talking about the concepts of whereby even in the sun and the moon, the light that is there is from the ultimate. Even in all living beings, that which digests food is from the ultimate. There is like all the energy that we're getting is from the ultimate place. There is nothing that is void of that energy itself. And then the concept of the tree, just to summarize, is that because all the water that a tree gets is from its roots. So the concept of the tree shows that from the ultimate is how all the manifest gets its life itself. Because life for a tree, the water itself is life. So if you can get the concept of the tree, whereby all the life is gotten from the ultimate, whatever we are seeing in the manifest as well, in front of us or within ourselves, like our mind, our thoughts, it's also part and parcel of the ultimate because it comes from that energy itself.
Thank you, Yogeshwar. Wait a minute, George, welcome. George, give me a second here.
Sorry, I couldn't find the mute button. Hello, everyone. Hello.
Hi, welcome. So George, we're discussing 7 sermons to the dead, and we wanted to ask everybody, and especially you, what do you think of 7 sermons to the dead? Folks, I have to tell you that it was George who is responsible for my interest in Jung. He has been doing meetups on Jung in New York, and he gave these long readings. You had to read like 300 pages to attend his meetup. And one day his reading was very short, and that was 7 sermons to the dead. And I said, oh, that I can read. And that's how I got started on Jung. So it's all his fault. And we had this great meetup in Bryant Park. So I have very fond memories of that. So, so George, what do you think? What do you think of 7 sermons to the dead, and what do you think of its place in the work of Carl Jung? Please take your time to talk about it.
Okay. Is everyone familiar with the Red Book?
A little bit, not too much. You should not assume. There will be many people who are not familiar with it. So you're welcome to talk about it.
Well, before I get into the Red Book, the 7 sermons to the dead it composes what the third book of the Red Book, Scrutinies. So the 7 sermons to the dead is the last third of what's known as the Red Book, Liber Nouveau, the new book. Okay, does that make sense to you guys?
Yep.
Okay, the Red Book comes from journals that Jung wrote between the years of 1913 and 1916. And what becomes Scrutinies, and the last part of Scrutinies, what's known as the 7 sermons to the dead, was composed around, I don't remember, 1916, 1917. You guys can Google it, check the details. Okay. So it's the dead speaking to Jung. Now, who are the dead? That's the question. Well, who are the dead? You have descriptions in here, in the preface, but my preference is to describe the dead as anyone who's divorced from the objective psyche. You guys understand what the objective psyche is? The objective psyche is the collective unconscious, the self. If you divorce yourself, if you live a purely materialistic existence, what Jung calls one-sidedness, if you are divorced from the archetypes, you are the dead. Does that make sense? So these are 7 sermons to the dead. I hope that makes sense. So the 7 sermons is a wonderful element of the Red Book. And the red book in general is what Jung has described as his encounter with the unconscious, not the personal unconscious, particularly the collective unconscious. Okay, it's what Jung calls inner work. It's what Jung calls also at that time active imagination. To take elements, configurations of energies, what Jung calls the archetypes, and personify them, and then have a conversation with those figures. That's what Jung calls. So it's the beginning of what Jungians call active imagination. Okay, so I hope I responded to your question in some manner. So this is part of the copy I'm holding right now is the copy that's an appendix and is a memories, dreams, and reflection. What I suspect most of you have. It's also available in Stephen Haller's work and in the Gnostic Jung. But I do want to say that the rendition that's here is not the same rendition that's in the red book. Okay, the protagonist here is Basilides, and it's Philemon in the red book. Anyone who's familiar with what I just said, feel free to add to that.
George, one question. What do you like about the 7 Sermons to the Dead? What does it mean to you?
That my inner work needs a lot of work. I'm spending too much time on shadow material. I don't know if that implies anything to anyone. The 7 Sermons to the Dead, I have not experienced anything like this so far. This is poetry to me. But if you do inner work, if you do deep inner work, you will be not compelled, but impelled to be a poet. This is poetry. This is poetry. If you have the courage to share, to express, and then to share what comes out of that experience, because that experience is, I don't want to sanitize it or romanticize it. It will be, it's terrifying. It's terrifying. And if you do the work, if you have the courage to do the work, and I would encourage anyone to have a facilitator as well. It could be your spouse, it could be your children, it could be an analyst. You know, don't do it alone. Okay, it's like going hiking. Don't go alone. you know.
Thank you, George. So folks, I want to follow up on something that George said, that this is poetry. Okay, I think this is a very deep idea, and I think some people were struggling with this. I think he captures it beautifully. It's, it is poetry, because what poetry does is that in a very short, really intriguing, really touching, deep way, it names the core idea. That's what this work is doing. Poetry is not prose. It is not trying to explain to you everything. It is trying to create almost a word image of reality. And it is by its nature, it is cryptic in the sense that it has few words. For it to work, it has to have few words. It's not full explication. And you have to use your own understanding of yourself, your own understanding of life in order to understand what is being said. So folks, I'm going to open it up for any questions and comments again at this stage. If you'd like to comment further on anything that was said, if you have any questions, go ahead and type an exclamation mark.
Let me just add a piece here, if I can, in response to what George presented. I don't know if you're familiar with the book by James Hillman and Sonia Shamsadani. Lament of the Dead, which they, in this wonderful discussion, as James Hillman is in fact dying, so he is opening up to the Pluroma, because he is leaving his earthly form. They have this incredible discussion, and in that discussion, someone had the brilliance to transcribe or record it and transcribe it, and that's what this is. But just listen to this and see if this doesn't echo what George said about the dead and about the sermons to the dead. That Sanyu says, so they're saying, what is the lament and who are the dead? That's the question that they're discussing. And he says, I think prior to that is the notion that they exist. Following what you are saying, contemporary culture has in a way killed off the dead. It is a rather bizarre paradox. The first task that Jung finds himself confronted with is the reanimating of the dead, acknowledging that their presence exists and haunt us, acknowledging that the dead are, and they have presences, they have effects. We turn our eyes away from future-oriented living and to what has gone before in the shape of animated history. History that is not simply a record, but history that is active. So whether the dead are our ancestors, whether the dead are what is dead in our culture, what Jung is doing in the Red Book is he's saying, talk to them. Talk to that which has been disavowed. Talk to that which has been driven into the unconscious. And in that discussion, in that back and forth, that energy will be reanimated, and it will reanimate the system. So you don't walk through modern life as a zombie, half dead and half alive, nor do you go off into esoteric spiritual imaginings that have no relevance in your lived life. He's saying, know what is dead and reanimate it through your interaction, through your relating to it and being moved by it. And I think that that's what's key. He introduces that concept because maybe COVID changed that, but in the West, we are death phobic and death denying, and we only want to go for the light, and the fruit is in the dark. So I just had to riff on that, George, sorry.
Wonderful, wonderful. I love that term, animate, to reanimate, yes. Yes, materialism has, I don't want to get too preachy, but materialism needs to be reanimated with the immaterial. There's been a divorce between the material and the immaterial. I do want to say that with regards to the poetry, if I may, Shrinkat,
please.
And my apologies for being tardy, guys. I was doing something else that needed my attention. But the poetry that Jung, as you're quite well aware of, is Hermetic poetry, particularly Gnostic poetry. So what I love about Jung is that he will compel the reader, if you're committed, to develop your literacy. So I would challenge everyone, if you're not too familiar with the Gnostic literature, to become familiar with it and then reread this material. You see how wonderful it is. It's also his way of scaffolding his analytical psychology. So it helps you to look at his map of psyche from a poetic perspective. And the poetic perspective he's employing is Hermetic philosophy, particularly Gnosticism. I hope that makes some sort of sense. And he does that quite intentionally because he's a cat that he's literate and he knows his history.
Wonderful. I just want to make one comment about the concept of dead here. We saw this in the Bible. We saw this in the Bhagavad-Gita. In the Bible, the dead are people, like what happens that whenever dead is being talked about, people automatically think of it in material terms, physical death. But actually life and death is not that which they're talking about. They're talking about spiritual life. Is your spirit alive? Are you conscious? Are you aware? Are you focused with all your being on the center. That is being alive. If you're doing that, then you're alive. If you are unaware of that and you're just attached to things around you in the periphery, then you're dead. Wonderful. Next up is going to be Brian, Zach, Evanique, and Madeline. Brian.
So I really like what George just said. I rang in before he spoke, but it really dovetails with what he said, because based on this, on the first sermon, I did take a look at Basilides of Alexandria, the city where East meets West. And he is a Gnostic. And yes, it does bring together the concepts that was highlighted at the beginning, Eastern and Western concepts, but it also tracks very nicely Gnostic concepts, which in some ways are a consolidation of some East and West concepts. Excuse me, Basilides, for example, is considered to have studied and maybe taught in Persia. In any event, the things that struck me is that all of his works have been lost, but others have commented on his works. And one concept that is probably in his work is that Basilides' work is that the Pluroma, which is used a lot by the Gnostics and appears often in the New Testament, that word appears a lot. The Pluroma, the fullness of God, descended on Jesus at his baptism. And so I think that ties in nicely, honestly, with everything Muriel's been saying, in that we try to, it's a challenge for each of us to let the fullness of the divine descend on our ego, or to be open to that. In the baptism, just leave it at that. The other thing that is interesting, so he's taking this Gnostic understanding of Jesus and the baptism, the Pluroma and Jesus. I think that Jesus becomes the Creatura, the creature in human form, and then each of us is a creature as exemplified by Jesus, and he exemplifies what the possibilities are. The other thing is that the Gnostics in general put their emphasis on, I'll just say salvation through knowledge, not through faith. And this, the challenge I think that Jung gives us is this one of knowledge, again, as Muriel has outlined so well and so often in this discussion this evening. So I just wanted to put that out there, because I found the work I'd done on Basilides really helped me understand Muriel's many comments and kind of affirms them. And then George mentioned the Gnostics. I'd have to say I did get a lot out of from looking at it.
Thank you, Brian. Next up is Zach, Evanique, Madeline, and Mike. Zach.
I guess I'm under the impression that we're going to do 7 sermons, and so in the spirit of actually focusing on sermon 1, I think the last passage, the last paragraph, is a little bit harder for me to grasp, because he talks about how thinking creates kind of like a deception, or in as much as you run after these thoughts, you fall again into the Pluroma. He's trying to point out that like the thought somehow congeals into an illusion that becomes the problem. And I in my personal life, I experience that type of thing as associated with social status. I think of like, oh, well, such and such a person does a certain thing and that's good, that makes them a good person. And then that congeals in my head and I start pursuing the desire to be a good person, to like mimic the behaviors of the good person. And so at least in that way, I can connect with the idea of like thought leading me away from my, like the truth, like, or just being itself. And I often find that being itself is very opposed in a way to pursuing social accolades and social acclaim and stuff like that. So I guess I'm just trying to, I'll leave it at that. I don't. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Zach. Next up is, and folks will respond to anything that you want. Next up is going to be Evanik, Madeline, and Mike. Evanik.
Yeah, something that George brought up and it helped me get it is because when he was talking about what Jung was referring to as dead, it was basically people, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, people who are attached to the material. And I think before that, I just didn't get it. Like I listened to it. I listened to all 7 maybe like a month ago, and then I re-listened to it today, and I still was just totally lost. So that, when you said that, really helped, because now I kind of got what you get. So I have to go back, of course, and reread it, or at least listen to it in that new light. Because for some reason, I just thought he was talking about, especially when he was talking about, the Pluroma, when he was talking about it, and I was like, I don't get, like, what could the dead do about it, right? Like, why is he doing these sermons to the dead and the dead can't change it? And I was like, oh, because they're not the dead that I'm thinking of. I was totally thinking in a material aspect. And I thought it was like somebody else said, it was kind of like this psychedelic dream that Jung was having. So it makes a little more sense now. And I was thinking of the Gita. I think you mentioned it, Shrikant. It's when we talk about your attachment to the material or to the periphery or to things outside of your control. And when you get attached to that, it moves you away from your center or your core or your being. And so that got me too. And then I think when Muriel was talking about the progression of getting to the shadow, you have to go through those things. And I should have written it all down, but part of it is like getting through the ego, and the ego could stop you from getting to the shadow, which will help you get to your center. I hope I'm making some type of sense, but that was something that it started clicking for me. And the last point I want to make is when Brian was talking about the Bible, and Jesus being that divine and human, and I was thinking of the concept where it says in John that we are all gods, right? So if we look at ourselves as all gods, and I think when you're talking about the audience of the dead, I think we lose the sense that we're all gods, or we're all spiritual beings. And when you lose that, that's when you die. That's when you die, is when you lose that concept of we are all spiritual beings, whether you believe in, God, like Christian God, but if you believe that you're just human and that you're just cells and things of that nature, if you're just cells and bones, then it really does become hopeless, right? But if you have some type of spirituality, or, a concept even that you're more than just your body, like even if you look at it as consciousness, then that reanimates you. And I like that Muriel said that about reanimating the dead, because that reanimates you. Because I think we start off like that. We start off knowing that we have this consciousness and we have this subconscious. I think we start off like that, but then life gets in the way, material aspects get in the way, and pursuing material things, we let that take over. But after that, we have to and I think in a sense we all die at some point, that we lose focus on that spiritual aspect of us, or our consciousness or our subconsciousness. But I think after that, once you start discovering it and really going deeper and realizing why you lost that, And I think that's part of the shadow work too. Is like, why did I lose that? Like, what happened? Then you're reanimated. And so now I have to go back and listen to it all over again, but it's starting to click. Barely clicking.
I think that was amazing set of observations. If anybody wants to, if either George or Muriel want to comment, they're welcome to do that. You don't need to, but if you want to, you're welcome to do that. All right, next up is going to be Madeline. Madeline, go ahead.
Yes, so thank you, Jorge, for raising the topic of the dead here. As I recall, I read that Jung believed that the realm of the psyche and soul intersected with the material realm in one place, which is the body. And he called it the Psychoid Realm. And so this discussion of the dead in this piece, it actually made me think of epigenetics. The triggering of ancient genomes in us that we carry on from our ancestors from time, immemorial, way back at the dawn of the human species, with various viruses integrated and all sorts of things that can be triggered by environmental factors at any time, very tied up with the immune system, and sometimes mental factors can affect it as well. So I was wondering, sorry about that. I was wondering what anyone thinks of this epigenetics idea for Jung's view of the dead here.
Let me wade in a little bit here. Ultimately, Jung believed that individuation was about the convergence of spirit and matter, that was the ultimate conjunctio between spirit and matter. And so he believed that the unconscious is going to manifest itself in both spirit and matter, and that it's where spirit and matter meet, he called the psychoid. So it's like there's this continuum between the infrared and the ultraviolet blue, between matter and spirit, yet there is this place where spirit and matter meet, and that's what we would experience as a synchronicity. That's the psychoid. So in terms of the dead, I've done a lot of work on the transgenerational complex and how complexes, which are, the realm of spirit, they're psychic rather than matter, but they do manifest in matter, and how that can be transported generationally. And certainly epigenetics is a way that biology shows us that indeed can happen. But if you look at it, and if you look at it from the point of patterns, you can see the patterns repeating itself in that we do carry our dead. We carry what they could not see. And we're given an opportunity, I believe, that's part of our task, is to take up the task of the dead, to take up in our opportunity to answer the questions that they couldn't answer. And I think that's why Jung talks to the dead, that he is talking to, those parts that have attach themselves to materiality and are divorced of the spiritual aspect. And he's talking to the dead. He's talking to your kin. He's talking to your ancestors. He's talking to those forms that gave birth to you. If you can have, like your father's nose, why couldn't you also have something in terms of like your mother's complex? Well, you can. And I think that lives dormant in our psyche. And then it wakes up when the time is right to see it. And when the willingness of the individual, of the creature, to try to take up that task. So I think that that's what Jung shows us in this is, someone made a comment about the last line of the first sermon and about the thinking and how thinking can take us off the path. Look at that in the context of Jung, who was his dominant function was thinking, and he had to surrender that in order to come into his feeling function. But he fought that. You see that in the Red Book, that he doesn't want to give up that dominant function, because we could say he's wedded to it. And then that occludes and eclipses his ability to be in the feeling function. So that whole idea that it's our encounters and our fidelity to our encounters to try to see more clearly, which takes us back to the self, the center and the circumference.
Thank you. Thank you, Muriel. Let's see. George, go ahead.
I'm probably going to regurgitate what Muriel said in some manner. But I want to address who was the person?
Madeline.
Madeline was saying regarding epigenetics. With regards to Jung's map of psyche, we should be suspend our tendency to localize. I don't think it serves here. If you're materialistic, and I honor that, I think it will serve, to use genetics, to localize these experiences. But for example, the individuation process, the relationship between ego and self, it's between subject and something that transcends the subject, but it's not out there, it's immanent, it's within. It becomes challenging. When one becomes addicted to faculties like persona, these psychic structures that ego employs to interface with collective consciousness, when one is addicted to that material, to those patterns, then one is dead. Now, the question is, how does one still use personae, the mask that we employ, to interface with our social ecology, to suspend that and then have what Jung calls inner work, to do inner work. It is a sacred work, to do inner work. And cross this threshold, this liminal space, the psychoid, that which articulates ego with self. Are you guys with me? That bridge between ego and self, that's a sacred journey. That is a liminal space. But most of us will rationalize not to do that journey. We prefer, it seems to me, and from my experience, because it's quite rare, most of us will prefer to be dead. And I find that in regards to psychic integrity, quite tragic. I hope I was lucid. I think I just reframed much of what Muriel said. Though Muriel, I'm fascinated by your intergenerational work.
Thank you.
Thank you, George. Next up is going to be a download from Encyclopedia Mike. Mike, I'll give you 2 minutes.
I don't want 2 minutes. I want to facilitate a debate between Muriel and, is it George or Jorge?
Both.
Both. What's the correct pronunciation?
We can have a debate between Jorge and George.
Okay, that's even better. I want to add a couple names to this thing. Epigenetics is a special case of panpsychism. One. Two, my favorite name in this that ties the Gita, the Bible, and all this and Islam together, Christianity, is Emanuel Swedenborg. And I'd like to bring, and Zoroaster, in deference to David Miller, who's also lurking in the background here. Is this about a sermon to the dead, or is it a sermon to us and our collective unconscious, our panpsychos uncycled? And Madeline's epigenetics is just turning on and off some bits in a bitmap, which are we is it dead? Are we trying to facilitate the panpsychic journey of the dead to a afterlife? And is that what it's all about? And we're trying to purify them and protect them from a journey through lots of evil spirits and Yetzer Hara and Mazda and all those other guys. And I'll go away and just listen, because I've never been in presence of this kind of an august group before. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. 2 minutes, perfect. A fantastic question. Who is this sermon to, Muriel and George?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I just had the insight as we were talking. Why do they come back as a throng from Jerusalem? You know, and so there's something collective in terms of what comes back. So I think George has given me something to reflect upon in terms of what is collectively asleep, what is collectively dead. And they have come back. And, you know, if you follow the Christian story is the dead will come back to create a new Jerusalem. And so is that what Jung is doing? So I think what he's doing is he's taking what's dead in the culture, and you look at, he is positioned between centuries. He's taking what is dead in the culture at the most horrific manifestation of shadow and darkness. And what he's trying to do in that is he's trying to make sense of how do we reanimate in a way that can be manifest? Because to just reanimate what has been denied or what has been killed off can also be destructive. I mean, that's what that was his essay on Wotan, and that Wotan was reanimated, but it was not the shadow side of what had been repressed. So I think he's talking, the dead they are spirit and they are matter. And I think that he's also saying that if we have communion with the dead, then we have communion with what our culture has lost, what our culture has denied, personally as well as collectively. But I say with Jung that it's an inner journey, and that each one of us has to find what comes to us when we open to that. And what comes, your dead are going to be different than my dead. And if we are faithful to doing the work that we are, whether it's our epigenetics, or whether it's the culture that we're born into, or whether it's the time that we're born into, it is our interface with the outer and the inner in as pure and as ardent and as authentic a way as we can. So I think that that's what the dead are. They are his personal dead. They are his cultural dead. They are the collective dead.
Wonderful, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Muriel. George, who is this sermon to?
Wow, man, I'll leave that for each of you to respond to. But my quick response would be another work that Jung did, Answer to Job, right? You know, based on the book of Job. I always say, remember the Job's friends? Remember his friends?
Mm-hmm.
Those are the dead. Each of us need to be a Job. We need to re-articulate our relationship with the objective psyche, with something that transcends us. So So there should be a marriage, but that's going to be a hell of an encounter. Okay, we could lose a lot. There's a big risk there. Okay, but those of us who are mesmerized by dogma, like Job's friend, those are the dead. Any Christian who according to Jung, that follows the dogmatic paradigms, those are the dead. Are you guys with me?
Yes.
The sermon is to that population.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, George. Next up is Phil, Evanique, and Madeline. Phil.
Yes, I just wanted to say, before George shocked us by saying that the sermon is to the dead as the people who are divorced from the collective unconscious, that kind of really woke me up and put this whole conversation on a different plane, I think, for a lot of us tonight. Before that moment, I assumed that the dead meant the ancestors, the people that have gone before. And I was thinking about G.K. Chesterton and his work Orthodoxy, where he talks about the democracy of the dead. And if you know that passage, it's a beautiful expression of keeping the tradition alive and letting people who have passed still vote with us today. And essentially, it's this idea, maybe a Jungian idea of keeping the spirit of the dead alive by keeping the traditions, not just perhaps the letter of the tradition, but the spirit of those traditions alive. Something I think that we are rapidly losing today as the deadening of our culture really rips to shreds anything related to the past. You know, our attention span has gone from hours to minutes, and our historical attention span has shrunk dramatically to where we are people without the past. And anyway, the message of this book is extremely intriguing to me in the sense that it is a call to realize the aspects of our spiritual disconnectedness and perhaps be able to somehow bridge that chasm. And there's so many philosophical traditions, I think, that are intertwined there. So that's all I just want to say.
Phil, that's a profound observation. I mean, what I can tell you of the experience in our meetups, we've been studying these three works: Gospel of John, Tao Te Ching, and Bhagavad-Gita in parallel.
Wow.
And we are, really diving deep into each of them. And it has really transformed, at least for me, and I think many other people, it has just transformed how people look at life, because it's a deep way of connecting with your spirit. And it's a deep way of connecting with both our past, our culture, our heritage, but mostly about, connecting with your spirit. Modern world is mostly materialistic. It is focused and attached to the peripherals. And that's the way of thinking. It is also analytical. It is about going into details of something very small and really understanding it well, and that there is value to that. But these spiritual traditions really hold your person together. That's what we are. And just encounter with these three works has been completely transformative for me and for many, many people here. And you can see the echoes of it in various points that people are making. Thank you. Next up is, go ahead, George.
I just want to quickly, because I think there's an inextricable idea with what you said, it's transformative. And that is the idea of redemption. And Jung talks about this. It's a leitmotif within Jung's works, particularly after 1944. The idea of redemption. And Muriel brought up that the dead is our ancestors. Yes, the ancestors, for example, is like Jung's father, who was a dogmatic minister. These are individuals who never experience a deep individuation process because they were too addicted to dogma, to scaffolding, persona-centric structures. If you do your work, it will not only be a personal transformation. It will be a collective, you will participate in a collective redemption. So yes, the dead is also your ancestors, but are those individuals who never had a genuine spiritual experience because they were living a dogmatic existence. You guys follow my logic? So yes, the dead are your ancestors, but a particular group of your ancestors, those who never had a true religious experience. I'm not talking about dogmatic religious experience. I'm talking about something like on the road to Damascus. You know, when you get hit hard and you're knocked off your horse. You know, those are the individuals I'm speaking to. You know, I'm sure Arjuna had a terrifying vision. Okay, it wasn't. You know, we should not sanitize that. It overwhelms you. So but if you participate in that process actively, you will redeem not only yourself, but those that came before you. And I find that imperative quite beautiful.
Wonderful, thank you. Next up is going to be Evanique, Madeline, and Zach. Evanique.
I have a question for George. I get why Job's friends were dogmatic. But I guess I'm having a little bit of I'm not understanding how Job was different from them, and the simple fact that in the story of Job has all these great things happen to him in his life, right? And then God and Satan play, this game where Satan bets God, and now Job has lost everything, right? And but my question is, I guess it wasn't Job dogmatic too? And then he lost everything, and I guess that's when he had to rely on God, but then he gets everything back. Wouldn't that turn him dogmatic? Like, I just don't see him as non-dogmatic. I guess the question is, what am I missing?
I hope you find what you're missing. I'm not sure if I could provide that to you in any manner or any degree. But you raise a good question. In terms contextually, I would say that's a good argument. Maybe Job was dogmatic, but existentially, his experience, he encountered something larger than himself. He had a direct experience. His friends did not.
So
and most dogmatic people are absent of direct experience.
And I would say that that's what's key, certainly in Jung's answer to Job, is that Job stayed faithful to that experience and kept trying to understand it. I am a good and faithful man. I'm doing everything I'm supposed to. So he never split off from what he was faithful to. He kept answering the question. And my interpretation of answer to Job is that Jung said, because of his faithfulness to the archetypal image that he encountered, that the archetypal image itself transformed. And the answer to Yahweh, which was a very judgmental God, gave birth to the Jesus, which was a God that was loving. So that the faithfulness to what you are heir to, in fact, can transform the archetypal image itself as it is presented through time. So I would say that speaks to, can an individual life affect the Pluroma? Yes. Answer to Job, Jung said yes. Because it is that faithfulness that now the God image is both creature and creator. It's God and it's man. It's spirit and it's matter. So the answer to Job is Jesus. So what is the answer to our culture? Jung is doing the same thing there. He is seeing how his father's Christian vision is dead. He is seeing what intrigues him about his mother's mysticism, and he grapples with the tension of those two things, and he gives us an answer, which is individuation.
Wonderful. Thank you. I have to read Answer to Job. I have not read that, so I'm really looking forward to that. And Evanik, I would recommend that too. I think you will also get a lot from it. Next up is Madeline, followed by Zach. Madeline.
Thanks. I'm just going to make a brief INTP foray here. I was thinking about what Mike said, panpsychism. There's also the opposite of panpsychism. I'll just call it no psychism for the moment. It's that whole school of cognitive science that believes that there's no mind, let alone a soul. They're just the actions of networks in the brain. And so that basically it's sort of an empty self. Suddenly that self is not so empty when they're competing for tenure. But nonetheless, that is a belief. And I felt for quite a while that there is a connection in that the same time that arose in our culture and became sort of getting into the public as a strain of thinking was around the same time that zombies became popular in terms of film. And it seems as if there's a connection. It's almost as if the two are either very similar, in other words, they seem alive, but they're not, or it is the subject, the zombie as subject, or the person as having a subject inside, a subjective point of view, is kind of in search of, restoring that subjective self and that living being, in the same way that we're kind of lacking it on the other side with this very kind of logical cerebral view of no psychism in the world of cognitive science.
Thank you, Madeline. Next up is going to be, let's see, Zach. Zach, go ahead.
I only wanted to realize that this conversation made me realize how effective the dead is as just a dramatic device. Like, just saying the dead just saying that is so dramatic, like, because I thought, oh, I can pinpoint this. And then I realized, wait, no, I can't. There's like 7 different things it could be, and they're all sort of swirling around and stuff. And I'm like, wow, that's like Shakespeare or something. That's like somebody who knows how to make a drama work so that it becomes part of your thought process, because you can't get past it. Like, you can't get past the way Shakespeare put it. Like, the characters become, the ghosts become, and I just wanted to point out, like, it's more powerful aesthetically than my mind is capable of analyzing it.
Oh, that's fantastic observation. Thank you, Zach, and absolutely true. 7 Sermons to the Dead. The first time I saw it, what? 7 Sermons to the Dead? Why is he talking to the dead? And oh, who are these dead? And they seem to want something. What do they want? What is their nature? And it just and life and death, that's really touches us at a very deep level. And it is something which is external. So it is a metaphor. And metaphors are very powerful. You start with something out there in the world, and then you bring it into your consciousness. So what is spiritual life and what is spiritual death? What does that look like? And you're using this external device of life and death outside to then move it inside. So absolutely, it's very, very powerful. All right, so folks, any final comments, George or Muriel? So folks, next time, I just want to tell you, next time we are going to be talking about Sermon 2, and which has the favorite concept, for me, it's the favorite concept, abraxas. So I'm really, really looking forward to that. So George, or first George, and then Muriel, any closing comments you would like to make?
The first thing that occurs to me is, Muriel, you can help me out with this, but this is much more than metaphor. Again, I talked about active imagination, and if I recall correctly, and the guy, I think is the authority on this. And there are others, but it's Lance Owens. So you could check out his material on this stuff. But I believe Lance states, and correct me, Muriel, or anyone else, this was precipitated by a real historical event. Jung was at home with his children, and there was an encounter. A knocking on the door, or what was the bell? I'm not sure. So there was a poltergeist experience that the family experienced. So I just want to throw that at you. So this is not just poetry. This is also Jung and his family, as Muriel stated, particularly the side of his mother's side of the family. They had a relationship with the occult. What I mean by that is with that which is not visible, that which is hidden. Jung's life, his personal narrative, was populated with episodes like this. So this was one of many. In this case, 1916, 1917. I don't know what else to say. That I'm excited that other people are reading this material, and I would urge everyone, because you don't have to buy the pictorial version. You could get the reader's edition. There is the red book. It's under $30. I have it somewhere. I don't know where.
Muriel has it. She uses it to do the thumping of the book.
There you go. That's it. So I would encourage everyone to develop a relationship with that one, and then with the pictorials. Whatever resonates with you.
Muriel, any closing thoughts?
Okay, thank you for mentioning Lance Owens. That the story I told you at the opening, when we were sitting and looking at the incredible painting on the wall at Bollingen, Lance was there. So he was one of the company that was exploring. And what did we do? Maybe we had a few glasses of wine as we looked at the picture and talked to one another. We started telling ghost stories. I mean, the place is alive with the dead. And so the story that George tells is that, that Jung was the veils were very thin at times. And when the veils are thin, these energies have an autonomy and they will manifest. I mean, I know that to be true. And so, in indigenous cultures, you have a ghost dance. I mean, it's relevant. So it's not just to say it's material and you leave it at that. It's to say it is material that has crossed the border in order to remind you of something that you have forgotten. And I think that that's what this is that he is trying to remind the culture of what we have forgotten and how to take the spirit that perhaps had died in the Christian story and reanimated in a way that the spirit of it can allow a vehicle of transformation. And I think that so the 7 sermons to the dead are giving us a distillation. So you don't have to read the collected works. I mean, do it. It's a lifetime. But what you can do is you can see, okay, what touches me in these sermons and what rises in me. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would pay particular attention to your dreams after having had this discussion together and see what comes forward, who comes forward, and don't make the mistake of saying it's just a symbol. When Jung said that to Salome in his encounter in the Red Book, she said, I am not a symbol. I am real. I am as real as you are. So, which means she was animated and she had a nature, and that nature he had to relate to, even if he didn't understand it.
Wonderful. Muriel, thank you so much. And George, thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. Just amazing set of comments. I think our group is ready to dive into this. I'm just amazed and just delighted with the range of comments that everybody has made today. So look forward to exploring this on a weekly basis. Next up is going to be chapter Sermon 2. Thank you, Muriel. Thank you,
Thank
Jorge.
you. Thank
See
you, everyone.
Bye.